October 14th, 1943. If you were an American airman stationed in England, you didn't call it October 14th. You called it Black Thursday. On that morning, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from airfields across Britain. Their target was the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep inside the heart of Nazi Germany. The mood on the tarmac was not one of patriotism or excitement. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of men who knew they were already dead. These bomber crews had a job to do. They had to fly hundreds of miles into enemy territory, line up a bomb site, and cripple the German war machine. But they had a fatal problem. A problem that military planners in Washington had ignored for years. The moment these bombers crossed the city of Aachen, near the German border, their protection vanished. The American fighter planes, the P-47 Thunderbolts and the Spitfires, had to turn back. They simply didn't have enough fuel to fly any further. For the next 3 hours, the bombers were alone. What happened next was not a battle. It was an execution. The German Luftwaffe was waiting. Hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarmed the American formation like sharks smelling blood in the water. They attacked from the front, firing 20-millimeter cannons directly into the cockpits of the B-17s. They fired rockets that tore wings off fuselages. They sat off the wingtips of the bombers just out of range of the machine guns and picked them off one by one. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to England that evening, the statistics were horrific. 60 B-17s had been shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 121 planes had taken major hits. 600 American airmen were dead or captured in a single afternoon. The 8th Air Force had lost 20% of its attacking force in a few hours. The generals did the math. At this rate of loss, there would be no 8th Air Force left in 2 weeks. The bombing campaign against Hitler was failing. The Allies had the bombs, they had the pilots, and they had the resolve. But they lacked the one piece of technology that could bridge the gap between England and Berlin. They needed a fighter plane. But not just any fighter. They needed a miracle. They needed a plane that could fly as far as a bomber, fight like an interceptor, dive faster than sound, and cost less than a tank. The problem was, according to every aeronautical engineer in the world in 1940, such a plane was physically impossible to build. You could have a heavy plane with long range, or a light plane with speed. You could not have both. It was a law of physics. But 3 years earlier, in a smoky office in California, a man named James Dutch Kindleberger had decided to break the laws of physics. To understand how the Mustang was born, you have to leave the freezing skies over Germany and go back to April 1940. The war in Europe had just begun and Britain was desperate. The Royal Air Force was looking for anything with wings and a gun. They sent a purchasing commission to the United States with a checkbook and a plea. They walked into the offices of North American Aviation in Los Angeles with a simple request. They wanted North American Aviation to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk for them under license. The P-40 was a sturdy plane. It was reliable. It was tough. But it was yesterday's technology. It was heavy. It struggled at high altitudes, and its design dated back to the mid-30s. Dutch Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, was a big man with a salesman's charm and a gambler's instinct. He looked at the British blueprints for the P-40. He knew his factory could build them. It would be easy money, safe money. But Dutch Kindleberger didn't like safe bets. He looked at the British commissioners and told them no. He told them that the P-40 was already obsolete. He told them that if they wanted to win the war, they didn't need more of the same. They needed something better. He proposed a completely new fighter, a fighter that had never been flown, never been tested, and currently existed only in his imagination. The British were stunned. They were in the middle of a war. They didn't have time for research and development. They asked him how long it would take. In the aviation world, designing a new fighter from scratch was a process that took years. The Spitfire took years. The Messerschmitt took years. Kindleberger looked at them and promised to have a prototype ready in 120 days. 4 months. It was an insane promise. It was the kind of promise a used car salesman makes, not an aerospace executive. But the British were desperate. They agreed, but they added a penalty clause. If the prototype wasn't ready in 120 days, the deal was off. The clock started ticking. Kindleberger walked out of that meeting and went straight to his chief designer. And this is where history delivers one of its greatest ironies. The man responsible for designing the plane that would crush the Nazi Air Force was not a corn-fed American boy. He was a German immigrant. Edgar Schmued had been born in Bavaria. He had served in the Austrian army during World War I. He had worked for General Motors in Brazil before coming to the United States. He spoke with a thick German accent. He was quiet, intense, and brilliant. And he had been carrying a design in his head for years, a design that he believed represented the future of flight. When Kindleberger told him they had 120 days, Schmued didn't panic. He went to work. The team at North American Aviation turned into a collective organism. They worked 7 days a week. They slept on the floor of the drafting room. They ate sandwiches with one hand while drawing schematics with the other. Schmued's design was radical. At the time, conventional wisdom said that a wing should be teardrop-shaped, thick at the front and tapering to a sharp point at the back. It was how birds were shaped, so it must be right. But Schmued wasn't interested in birds. He was interested in mathematics. He proposed something called a laminar flow wing. He pushed the thickest part of the wing further back, away from the leading edge. The idea was to keep the air flowing smoothly over the wing for as long as possible before it became turbulent. Turbulence creates drag, and drag is the enemy of speed. By reducing drag, Schmued calculated he could make the plane faster without needing a bigger engine. He could also put huge fuel tanks inside those thick wings. But the wing wasn't the only innovation. Every liquid-cooled engine needs a radiator. Usually, designers strapped the radiator under the nose of the plane like a chin. It worked, but it was like pushing a brick through the wind. It created massive resistance. Schmued decided to move the radiator to the belly of the plane, underneath the pilot. Then he did something genius. He designed the air scoop for the radiator to take advantage of something called the Meredith effect. As the air rushed into the scoop, it was heated by the hot coolant from the engine. Hot air expands. As that expanded air shot out the back of the scoop, it actually created a tiny amount of thrust. It was, in a very primitive sense, a jet engine before jet engines existed. The cooling system didn't just cool the engine, it helped push the plane forward. Day after day, the prototype took shape. The floor of the factory was a scene of controlled chaos. There were no computers to run simulations. Every calculation was done by hand with slide rules. Every curve of the metal was hammered out by craftsmen who judged the shape by eye and touch. On September 9, 1940, exactly 102 days after the contract was signed, the hangar doors opened. The prototype known as the NA-73X, was rolled out into the California sunshine. They had beaten the impossible deadline by 18 days. The plane was beautiful. It was sleek, angular, and looked predatory even while sitting still. But as the test pilots climbed in and the engineers celebrated, there was a flaw hiding deep inside the machine. A flaw that would almost kill the project before it ever saw combat. The British took delivery of the first batch of Mustangs. They were impressed by the build quality. They loved the visibility from the cockpit. They loved the range. But when they took the Mustang up to 20,000 feet, the dream collapsed. The engine they had used, the American-made Allison V1710, was a powerhouse at low altitudes. It was a drag racer. But it had a single-stage supercharger. This meant that as the plane climbed higher and the air got thinner, the engine couldn't suck in enough oxygen to burn the fuel efficiently. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang gasped for air. It became sluggish. It became a sitting duck. The Royal Air Force was disappointed. They had wanted a high-altitude interceptor to fight the Germans. What they got was a plane that was excellent at mowing the lawn, but useless in a dogfight. They relegated the Mustang to reconnaissance duties. They used it to take pictures and shoot up trains. It seemed like Dutch Kindleberger's gamble had failed. The 120-day miracle was a dud. But sometimes history hinges on a single conversation, a single what if. In England, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker was invited to fly the new Mustang. He took it up for a spin. He felt the handling. He felt how responsive the controls were. He felt how slippery the airframe was. It wanted to go fast, but the engine wouldn't let it. Harker landed the plane, climbed out of the cockpit, and reportedly said to the engineers,
"The point about this airplane is that you don't have to pull it around the sky. You just put the stick over, and she goes." He sat down and wrote a memo that would change the course of the war. He suggested, almost as an experiment, that they rip out the American Allison engine and replace it with the British Merlin 61. The Merlin was the engine that powered the Spitfire. It was a masterpiece of engineering. It had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. It didn't care about thin air. It could breathe at 30,000 feet just as well as it could at sea level. The engineers decided to try it. They took a Mustang airframe, modified the engine mounts, and shoehorned the massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the nose. It was a tight fit. It required new plumbing, new cooling lines, and a new propeller. They called this hybrid the Mustang X. When the test pilot pushed the throttle forward on the first flight, he was nearly thrown back into his seat. The transformation was instantaneous. The Allison-powered Mustang topped out at 390 miles per hour. The Merlin-powered Mustang hit 440. But the speed wasn't the most important part. The most important part was where it could fly. The test pilot took it up, 10,000 feet, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. The engine didn't choke. It roared. It kept pulling. The data was sent back to the United States. Packard Motors in Detroit immediately began building the Merlin engine under license. The factory in California switched production. The P-51B was born. This was no longer just a plane. It was a long-range sniper rifle. With the new engine and the addition of drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when a fight started, the Mustang now had a range of over 1,600 miles. Suddenly, the map of Europe changed. Before the Mustang, the red circle of Allied fighter protection stopped at the German border. Now, that red circle extended all the way to Berlin, all the way to Poland, and back. But the pilots didn't know this yet. The bomber crews didn't know this yet. And most importantly, Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe didn't know this yet. They were about to find out the hard way. By late 1943, the skies over Germany had become a graveyard for American bombers. But in the hangars of England, the new P-51 Mustangs were arriving in crates. Mechanics worked around the clock to assemble them. Pilots, used to the heavy, tub-like P-47 Thunderbolt or the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, looked at this new, slender machine with suspicion. It looked fragile. It looked like a race car, not a war horse. The belly of the plane was filled with coolant pipes. The pilots joked that one bullet in the radiator would scald you to death before you hit the ground. But then they flew it, and the suspicion turned into love. It was fast, it was agile, and it had legs. The strategy of the air war was about to shift from defense to offense. For years, the role of the fighter escort was to stay close to the bombers. The orders were strict. Protect the bombers at all costs. Do not pursue the enemy. The fighter pilots felt like they were on a leash. They had to sit there and watch German fighters dive on them, waiting for the enemy to strike first. Then came General Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was a legend. He was the man who had bombed Tokyo in 1942. When he took command of the 8th Air Force fighters in early 1944, he walked into the headquarters and saw a sign on the wall that said, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle tore the sign down. He issued a new order, an order that would doom the Luftwaffe. He told his pilots, "Your job is to destroy the German Air Force. I am unchaining you. Go find them. Go kill them." This was the hunting license. The effect was immediate. When the bomber streams crossed into Germany, the Mustangs didn't just hover around them in a defensive box. They ranged out ahead. They roamed the skies in wolf packs. They looked for the white contrails of German fighters rising to intercept. Imagine being a German pilot in 1944. You were flying a Messerschmitt Bf-109. You have spent 3 years slaughtering unescorted bombers. You see a formation of B-17s approaching Berlin. You check your fuel. You check your guns. You begin your climb expecting an easy fight. You are deep in your own territory. You are safe. And then, out of nowhere, silver flashes dive on you from above. You look around, confused. Single-engine fighters? Here? Over Berlin? It's impossible. You are 600 miles from England. But the bullets tearing through your wing tell a different story. The Mustangs didn't just protect the bombers, they hunted the hunters. When the German planes tried to dive away, a tactic that worked against the Spitfire, the Mustang dove with them. When they tried to climb, the Mustang climbed with them. There was no escape. The psychological impact was devastating. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously stared at the sky one afternoon and saw single-engine American fighters over the capital. He turned to his aide and said, "I realized then that the war was lost." The climax of this new strategy came in late February 1944. It was called Big Week. The Allies launched a massive 6-day assault on the German aircraft industry. They bombed the factories that built the fighters. But the real goal was to draw the Luftwaffe into a fight. It was a trap, and the Germans took the bait. They threw everything they had into the sky. Thousands of fighters clashed in the freezing air 5 miles above the earth.
It was the largest air battle in history. When the smoke cleared at the end of the week, the Luftwaffe was broken. They had lost huge numbers of planes, but more importantly,
They had lost their pilots. You can build a new plane in a few weeks. It takes 2 years to train a fighter pilot. The Germans were losing their aces, their veterans, their instructors. They were being replaced by teenagers with only a few hours of flight training. The Mustang pilots began to rack up scores that seemed impossible. Men like George Preddy, a quiet boy from North Carolina who flew a Mustang named Cripes-a-Mighty. On one mission, he shot down 6 German planes in 5 minutes. He described it not as a battle, but as a rhythm. Aim, fire, break. Aim, fire, break. The Mustang was an extension of his will. Then there were the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails. African-American pilots who had to fight 2 wars, one against fascism overseas and one against racism at home. They were given the P-51 and painted the tails a distinctive crimson. Their record became legend. Bomber crews, who didn't care about the color of a man's skin when they were under fire, began requesting the red tails specifically. They knew that when the Mustangs with the red tails were around, the German fighters stayed away. But the engineers back in California weren't done. They knew the P-51B had a problem. The cockpit canopy was framed like a birdcage. It had blind spots. In a dogfight, a blind spot is death. If you can't see behind you, you die. The British had been experimenting with a Malcolm hood, a bubbled canopy that slid back. But North American Aviation went further. They cut down the rear fuselage of the plane and installed a massive teardrop-shaped piece of plexiglass that offered 360-degree visibility. They called it the P-51D. This is the Mustang you see in movies. This is the Mustang you see at air shows. The Silver Bullet, the definitive version. They also added 2 more 50 caliber machine guns, bringing the total to 6. That's nearly 3,000 rounds of ammunition per minute. When a P-51D fired all 6 guns, the recoil was so strong it would actually slow the plane down in midair. The sound was like a chainsaw ripping through canvas. They introduced the K-14 gun sight. This was a marvel of analog computing. It used a gyroscope to calculate the lead angle. The pilot just had to dial in the wingspan of the enemy plane and keep the reticle on the target. The sight did the math. It told the pilot exactly where to shoot to hit a turning target. It turned average pilots into sharpshooters, and sharpshooters into gods. By the summer of 1944, the P-51 Mustang owned the sky. They were everywhere. They were strafing airfields, blowing up locomotives, sinking barges, and chasing the remnants of the Luftwaffe into the ground. There is a story of a German pilot who was captured late in the war. An American interrogator asked him, "When did you know it was over?" The German pilot didn't talk about D-Day. He didn't talk about Stalingrad. He said, "I knew it was over when I saw a Mustang flying over my airfield, with its landing gear down." The American pilots were so confident, so dominant, that they were landing on German airfields just to shoot up the parked planes and then taking off again. It was total humiliation. But the war wasn't just won by machines. It was won by the synergy of man and machine. The Mustang was unforgiving if you mistreated it. With the rear fuel tank full, the center of gravity shifted backward. If a pilot pulled too hard on the stick right after takeoff, the plane would snap roll and crash. It killed many rookies. It demanded respect.
But for those who mastered it, it was freedom. Chuck Yeager, the man who would later break the sound barrier, became an ace in a day in a Mustang, shooting down 5 Germans in a single sortie. He later said the Mustang did everything you asked it to do, and it did it fast. As the Allied armies marched toward Berlin in 1945, the sky above them was silent. Not because there were no planes, but because there were no German planes. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The bombers that had been slaughtered in 1943 were now flying in parade formations, untouched, reducing German cities to rubble. The 120-day miracle had done its job. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the P-51 Mustang was at the apex of piston engine technology. It was the ultimate refinement of the propeller-driven fighter. But even as it celebrated victory, it was already becoming a dinosaur. The jets were coming. The German Me-262 had terrified Allied pilots in the final months of the war. It was faster than the Mustang. It could fly higher. If the war had lasted another 6 months, the Mustang might have met its match. But in 1945, the Mustang stood alone as the victor. North American Aviation had built more than 15,000 of them. They had cost about $50,000 each to produce. In terms of return on investment, it was arguably the best money the U.S. government ever spent. The Mustang continued to serve. It fought in Korea, where it was called back into action for ground attack missions. But the age of the jet had arrived. The whine of the Merlin engine was replaced by the roar of the Saberjet. Today, 80 years later, the P-51 Mustang holds a special place in the human psyche. It is more than just aluminum, steel, and rubber. It is a symbol. When you see a P-51 at an air show today, watch the crowd. Old men stop talking. Children stop playing. Everyone looks up. The sound of that V12 engine is unmistakable. It doesn't sound like a machine. It sounds like a living thing. It whistles. It pops. It growls. It represents a moment in time when the world was on the edge of a cliff, and a group of engineers in California, led by a salesman and a German immigrant, decided to build wings for the rescue party. Think about the timeline again. 120 days. In today's world, you cannot get a permit to build a garage in 120 days. In 1940, they designed the machine that saved civilization. Edgar Schmued, the designer, lived a long life. He went on to design other planes, including the F-86 Sabre. But he knew that the Mustang was his masterpiece. He once said, "The Mustang was always a thoroughbred. It had to be handled with care, but if you treated it right, it would give you the world." And Dutch Kindleberger, the man who made the impossible promise, he proved that sometimes the biggest gamble is the only one worth taking. He didn't just sell a plane to the British. He sold them survival. The P-51 Mustang serves as a permanent reminder of what human beings can do when the stakes are absolute. When failure means the end of freedom, impossible deadlines disappear. Impossible physics are overcome. There is a final image to leave you with. Picture a B-17 bomber crew in 1944. They are cold, they are terrified, and they are deep over enemy territory. They see a dot on the horizon. Their hearts stop. Is it a Messerschmitt? Is this the end? And then, as the dot gets closer, they see the square tail. They see the silver wings. They see the scoop on the belly. And over the radio, they hear a drawl from a boy from Texas or Ohio or California. "Little friends are here, big friends. We got you." That is the legacy of the P-51. It was the guardian angel of the sky. It was the plane that made the difference between defeat and victory. It was the plane that saved the world in 120 days.